Hi, I'm Chip Hardwick. I'm the executive for the Synod of the Covenant. And I want to welcome you to this preaching workshop. Those of you who are here in person on Zoom, as well as everyone who will be watching this later on YouTube. I want to wish you a happy new year, happy February, and welcome you to this great workshop. We're looking forward to having Peter Henry speak with us. I'll introduce him more formally in a second about post-pandemic preaching. But before I do, I want to just alert you to a couple of things that are coming in the life of our synod. So I'm going to share my screen. And if you all can let me know if you can see that. Yes, yep. Great. Thank you so much. Oh, I didn't change it from January to February. It's February now. The first thing I want to let you know is that as you know, we have Peter today leading this preaching workshop, and then Carolyn Helsel from Princeton Seminary will lead next month on preaching about racism in an era of CRT bans. She has literally written the book, 2 books about preaching about racism, so she will be a really great conversation partner for us next month. Then in April, it is the first Wednesday of April, as you all probably know, is during Holy Week, and so we are not having a preaching workshop in April. Something we are having in March, though, our partners at Science for the Church are presenting a 3-part webinar called The Church and Mental Health. As you can tell by the name, Science for the Church, they're looking at these things from both a faith perspective and a scientific perspective. So I hope you'll put this on your calendar. It's March 9th, March 16th, and March 23rd from 1 to 2 in the afternoon by Zoom. And then one other webinar I'd like you to be aware of is a clergy loneliness webinar called A Path to Belonging. And these are from our partners at LeaderWise. Mary Kay Duchesne and Mark Sunby are 2 of the people we work with at LeaderWise, and they have written this book. It'll be a 3-part webinar also starting towards the end of April. Our newsletter went out yesterday, and I saw the registrations for this coming in just as soon as the newsletter went out. And so if you find yourself in a situation where this would be helpful for you, I hope you'll take advantage of it. The way you can learn about these and other activities is, of course, through our website. You can find more detail, and then also by getting our newsletter. If you haven't subscribed, I'd love for you to do that. We won't spam you. We'll just send you something once a month at the beginning of the month. You can also find and follow us on Facebook or watch us on YouTube. And here's my information. I would love to be in touch with you. If there's anything I can do to strengthen your presbytery or your church, I would love to hear from you. And no one else listens to my voicemails. That's my cell phone, or reads my emails. Now, back to the main event. We're so excited to have Peter Henry here. I'm going to tell you the important things about Peter, and then I will tell you about the even more important things about Peter. So Peter is the pastor at the Davidson College Presbyterian Church in Davidson, North Carolina. He had served within the bounds of our synod at Grosse Pointe Memorial Church before moving there. And he's also served congregations in Princeton, New Jersey, and Charlotte, North Carolina. I already outed him as having his undergrad from the University of Illinois. I won't tell you the year, but he also has MDiv, a THM, and a PH.D. in preaching from Princeton Seminary. And he has 3 kids and a wife who is a published playwright, novelist, and award-winning short story author. But the most important thing you need to know about Peter is that I have always called him the great pioneer of my faith, because Peter was the year ahead of me in the PhD program. And so he told me about what it was like to take seminars. He told me about what it was like to have a dissertation proposal. He told me what it was like to have your comprehensive exams, and was just so helpful for me every step along the way. And so, Peter, I'm really grateful for your friendship and for your partnership in the gospel, and for all the ways you've been very helpful to me individually too. So let's give Peter some happy hands and welcome him to this webinar.
Thank you, Chip, and thank you to everybody for being here. What Chip didn't tell you was not only was I the pioneer of his faith, I was the only person admitted to the program the year that I came in. And so all of my seminars were one-on-one with the professors. And I was normally the student who sat in the back of the class, didn't ask questions, never interacted with professors. and did not have that luxury that first year before Chip showed up on the scene. Excuse me. I'm grateful to be with everybody today. Looks like most everybody is on my screen. So if you have a question at some point, whether you raise your physical hand or whether you use the icon, I should be able to see that. Or you can always use the chat feature as a way to ask questions. I tend to have a bad habit of having too much information and trying to plow through it so quickly and not always leaving enough space and time for people. So feel free to put those questions into the chat to kind of force me to stop sometimes to make sure that I'm being attentive to questions you may have. I want to tell you something that I told our elders and deacons at our recent officer retreat. I told them to be wary of people who know everything about the post-pandemic 21st century church. And I would say be wary of anyone who tells you they know everything about in the post-pandemic era. Frankly, what I'm going to do today is raise more questions than provide answers. What you're really going to get today are some of my thoughts as I wrestle with preaching in a post-pandemic era. As Chip noted, while I have a background and a degree in homiletics, the study of preaching, I'm a preacher 2-3 Sundays a month, sometimes 4, depending upon the season. Our church is online and in person. I was here when we did all virtual during the first weeks of the pandemic, and now that we're back in person. So whatever your issues are that you're struggling with, I'm right there with you. This isn't going to be one of those talks from someone who hasn't been in a pulpit a little while and hasn't had to do it regularly and who's just talking about what they read. I'm going to try and share with you some of the things that we're wrestling with. And I hope that you're going to give me some answers, or at least give me some insights about some of the things that you're doing in your congregations and your ministries of preaching. I also want to warn you, I'm not a particularly systematic or good theologian, so this will be a little light on the theology and a little more deliberate on some of the pragmatic and practical elements of preaching. But with that said, I want to take a step backwards. Once upon a time, before there was a practice called preaching, or at least the one that we named it that way, there were people who studied rhetoric, and we learned some things as preachers from those ancient rhetoricians. And those ancient rhetoricians would talk in their writing about the art of persuasion. That's eloquence, the art of persuasion. It's the faculty of discovering the available means to bring someone on board with what you're trying to persuade them of. And as they would study speech, they would talk about speaker, speech, audience, and the effect that you're going for. And then they would talk about forms of logic. Won't worry about those right now. And then preaching eventually, when it came on the scene by some, was considered kind of a subspecies of rhetoric. Even though it was a subspecies of rhetoric for some, you all may know with me Paul's definition of preaching, or the purpose of preaching according to the Apostle Paul. It comes from 1 Corinthians 14. He says, those who prophesy, which is the New Testament Pauline word for preaching, those who prophesy do so to 1, build up, 2, encourage, and 3, console. So if the ancient rhetoricians talk about being able to be persuasive to the desired effect, are we trying to build people up? Are we trying to encourage them? Or are we trying to console them? Those might be 3 things that you could ask yourself about your preaching. I know I ask it pretty regularly. And so if we've got these goals for preaching, and if these rhetoricians talk about speaker, speech, audience, and effect, those are really helpful. But I would also throw in there that we need to consider the medium. And I'm sorry, I left out the word occasion. The ancient rhetoricians talked about speaker, speech, audience, effect, and occasion. My interest these days is on medium. So the ancient rhetoricians, and therefore in some ways the ancient homileticians, generally imagined that there was a solo, an individual standing in front of a group of people at a particular time, making an offering in person. You and I all know that post-pandemic, for many of us, that is no longer the case, that we are an individual standing in one place, only talking to the people in front of us, and that we need to be attentive to the medium, the way by which our sermons are being offered to people. Now, Chip knows that one of my critiques of 20th century preaching texts, the ones that we would often use in our seminary classes, is so often they wrote about sermons as if sermons were an event that happened outside of something bigger called worship. And the homiletic texts also often talked about sermons almost as if they didn't depend on an audience. Among the things they would often ignore is the multi-generational nature of our worship services. That always was kind of annoying to me, that we could be preaching just about anything to anyone, anywhere, according to some of these preaching texts. And for me, it was an act of worship for a body of people in worship that was inclusive of a variety of listeners in that particular moment. So, enter into the 21st century. Some folks in mainline traditions are starting to be a little more inclusive. But even in our early 21st century preaching texts, it felt to me like a lot of our folks were ignoring the fact that you and I were beginning to stand in spaces with screens, and that people were beginning to have visuals at the gas pump and at the grocery store. They were taken in PowerPoint presentations. And even though some preachers in some churches were beginning to enter into that world, most of our preaching texts had very little conversation about what it means to have images as part of worship. And that, even though there was a rise in literature about different modes of learning, and some of you all know that your writers often talk about folks who learn visually, folks who learn in an auditory way, people who learn by reading and writing, and folks who learn by use of their body, the kinesthetic mode of learning. And yet our preaching texts often ignored the different ways of learning, particularly the visual in addition to the auditory. Now, most experts agree that people are a combination of these kinds of learning styles, even if they have a predominant way of learning. But by and large, our preaching texts ignored those different ways of learning. And by the way, as a side note, one of my personal areas of interest is how Presbyterians can be more in touch with embodiment in worship, that we have 5 senses. We worship love in the flesh. We worship a resurrected Christ. And often Presbyterians act like we're just brains on sticks with a couple of ears to listen. And one of my real interests theologically is re-embodying our worship, both in terms of how it's designed and how we participate. So, I've had these critiques of preaching, and now one of my interests going forward involves the medium, which I think in some ways connects now to some of those extra learning styles or ways that people learn. And so today I want to talk primarily in this post-pandemic environment about the medium, how our messages are being shared, and what impact that has on what we say and how we say it. So what do I mean by that? So a couple of, and the reason I'm focusing on that, you all know this because you're here, but online worship is here to stay. It is not going anywhere. As a matter of fact, let me share with you a statistic. We'll get through this first slide for a moment. This is just about the decline in worship attendance here. But I want to focus on, so you'll see that there's definitely been a decline in worship attendance. But the one I want to focus on, look on the right-hand column. If you can see my mouse. So you've got people who've attended worship services in person. March 22, this is done by Pew. In our mainline churches, 68% of people who attend worship had attended in person in the last month. But look to my right. You're right. 56% of people had also attended online. Some of them attended only online. Some attended both. And that's one of the things that we're learning. Not only are people worshiping online with us, they are worshiping online and in person sometimes. We have folks who come on Sunday one Sunday, they're online the next Sunday, they're traveling the following Sunday. In addition to having some of the people who are still part of what they call the couch church. I have a family the other day that, maybe you've had this experience. I'm thinking about some family or some person, and I'm kind of annoyed I haven't seen them in person. And I think, gosh, I guess we lost them. And then I'll see them in the grocery store and they'll say, hey, that last sermon, I really appreciated you talking about fan fiction, Peter, because I'm a real big, I love fan fiction. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know they were still with us. Now, maybe sometimes in some settings, I also think there are church members who know they're going to see me at a committee meeting, so they go back and check a sermon or two, just so they can tell me that they saw a sermon. But there are definitely some folks with us. I've had them say, we're going to try and not be a couch church family anymore. We're going to try and come back. But the truth is that people are doing all of the above. And so it's here to stay. I mean, some of you all read some of the work that's produced by Carey Nieuwhof. One of his quotes that I appreciate is this: everyone you want to reach is online. If you ditch your online presence when your building reopens, you ditch the majority of people you're trying to reach. People during the pandemic became accustomed to being able to join us online and worship with us online. And even when they come back in person, in some way, shape, or form, they're also going to be online in addition to the people that are always there. And by the way, as a little factoid, and as research continues, not only are our church members still worshiping with us online, even when they're in person, they worship with other churches. People have an ability now to listen to other preachers. I'll tell you about a guy who came to me about 2 weeks ago in a moment. I'll talk about the focus of his talk, but he began by saying, Peter, on Sunday mornings, I watch you and I watch Scott Black Johnston in New York, right? And he's not the only person, church member I know, who's worshiping with other communities of faith in addition to our own. So online worship is here, which of course raises a host of questions, which is part of what I'm trying to deal with today. It raises questions about embodiment and relationship. I don't know about you. I'm a better preacher when I see people and when I know people. There are folks who are the preachers that can preach to anybody, anywhere. I'm not that guy. I'm the person who needs to know the people in the pew and know what's going on in Davidson and what's happened at the local elementary school, to be aware of what's going on in their lives. And so when people aren't in front of me in the same way, I feel like I lose some of my efficacy as a preacher. And I also think it raises questions for the church as the body of Christ. What does it mean that the Michael family is never here on Sunday morning? They're worshiping with us, they're part of us, but their fellow members never see them. And the kids never interact. And I believe there's something lost there. So there are questions about relationship and embodiment in this online world that we live in, but it is where we are. I want to, in one last slight setup to the questions that are on my mind, I can't speak for your church. I'll speak for my church and my setting before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, at Davidson College Presbyterian Church, we didn't think a lot of televangelists. We wouldn't have said that, but we would have said people that are focusing on online worship. That's not. We're real worshipers. We're real preachers. We don't do that stuff. And we, like a lot of people, suddenly became televangelists because of the pandemic. It was very humbling to go to websites and to go to churches that we might have looked down our noses on once upon a time. And so we certainly had a bit of a growth curve, as I imagine some of you all perhaps did. Our live stream before worship, this is not a joke. We actually had one. We would do it at 11 o'clock. We would put an iPhone on a tripod in the back of a sanctuary that seats about 900 people. And we would have a wide angle shot of the chancel, and the iPhone would pick out the noise that was coming through the room. There wasn't a direct audio feed. It's about as bad an experience as you could possibly imagine. But that was our live stream. We were online before worship before the pandemic, and the pandemic certainly humbled us. One other thing about life before the pandemic, do you all remember December 2019, the Washington Post put out a study that had been done by Pew Research about the length of sermons? Does anybody remember this? So this is what the Pew went online. They analyzed audio, video, word count of sermons to estimate lengths of sermons in different denominations. Get this, according to the Pew Research Center in December 19, the average length of a sermon, of online sermons, at least that they could find, was 37 minutes. Who here preaches 37 minutes? Anybody? And no, I'm not going to make fun of you if you do. Anybody? Okay. So here's what they found. That they looked at differences among different traditions. The average sermon length for a Roman Catholic preacher was 14 minutes. For a mainline Protestant preacher, it was 25. For an evangelical, it was 39. And for historically Black Protestants, it was 54 minutes of the people who were preaching online. Now, I raised that because as we went into the world of televangelism, one of the things that we definitely found is that people, their attention on one speaker for any length of time diminished. That there was something different about watching Peter Henry on a screen versus Peter Henry in person. And so we began to adopt, rather than preaching 54 minutes of 37 minutes, which was the average, we began to design worship services that were shorter and sermons, therefore, that were shorter, with the belief that the attention span was more limited. And again, to tell a story on the Henry family, the first 8 weeks of the pandemic at Davidson College Presbyterian Church, we were 100% pre-recorded. It wasn't live streamed. The way we interpreted our emergency closure orders in our county was that we weren't even supposed to be gathering as a small group to live stream. So everything was pre-recorded. Our organist recorded at his house. I recorded at my house. Which meant that every Sunday I watched church, worshiped with my family in our living room on our TV. And it was really good for me as a preacher because, number one, I learned that, in fact, a small family huddled together in their living room to watch worship doesn't have the world's longest attention span. And boy, the things my children would say about me in my presence while I was preaching, like they say, "I can't believe you just said that, Dad." I'm like, "Shut up, I'm preaching, be quiet, listen to me on the screen." But it gave me a lot of sympathy, empathy, compassion for our families with children who were worshiping online, and what it was like, therefore, to expect them to sit in their living room for 13, 15 minutes of a sermon and think that they're with me for that whole time. And for anybody with kids, you know how it goes. You're trying to focus on Peter, but someone spilled his syrup because you're eating some breakfast while you're watching church, or children interject, they need to go to the bathroom, but Peter's been now preaching for about 11 minutes and I'm trying to focus in on his sermon. And so we really began to hone in on worship services and sermons that were shorter. And by the way, I don't know about you all, but I always loved pictures and stories that people would tell me. And one of the online pictures that was posted when I thought about people in the pandemic was the picture of someone's cat that was watching me preaching. They had a picture of their laptop, and the cat was right at the laptop watching me on the screen. Like, even my cat loved Peter's sermon today. I'm like, all right, everybody, focus in here for a moment. So the idea of a short attention spans, by the way, isn't new. And so let me share my screen again. So here's something to look at. According to research, from 2000 to 2015, the average attention span went from 12 seconds to 8.25 seconds, folks focusing in on a specific item. You see the little blurb on the bottom? Our average attention span is shorter than that of a goldfish, according to researchers. And so when we think that somehow being on a screen doing online worship is going to hold people's attention for long periods of time without ways to kind of break that up, and we'll talk about that in a moment, it's a pretty limited thing. We can think more about, and we can trust a little bit more in attention spans and groups when people are in a setting where they're part of an audience. But when people are at home online, this idea of a 9-second attention span probably hits a little more to home with what we're battling with. A couple other stats about attention. Let's see. By the way, we're all forgetful people. I love some of these stats. That 7% of us have forgotten our own birthdays from time to time. That 40% of us almost have forgotten one basic piece of information or lost one everyday item in the past week. So attention spans, forgetfulness, they're part of who we are these days. But when we think about folks who are online as part of our post-pandemic preaching, I know this image is a little bit smaller, but take a look for a moment. What drives some of our lack of attention? We check our email 30 times an hour, according to some research. Average users pick up their phones more than 1,500 times a week. We go to web pages where we're only reading about 28% of the content, and going to web pages where we're only staying on it for 10 to 20 seconds at a pop. So if you want a little evidence of our attention spans and distractions. And so think about the person who's at home who is Peter thinks he's going to stand in a pulpit and have one angle shot of me for 15 minutes. And do you imagine they're not going to grab a phone at some point to double check something? They're on their computer, that they're not going to click their other web browser to open up another web page and check that out. Like we've got some uphill battles when it comes to people's attention, especially when it's part of our online worship. And then there, and in this particular page, this information I took from a website that was interested more in the issue of marketing. Obviously, we're not marketers. And at the same time, there are still some tips that they give to marketers that preachers can learn from, whether it be clear in our messaging, whether it be keeping things short and sweet, remembering the power of stories, and remembering media-rich videos, images, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And I will, when I'm done, give Chip some links that you all can go and check out some of this research for yourself. But so attention spans are something that we're going to be dealing with as we continue to move along in post-pandemic preaching. So I'm curious I would love to pause for a moment. I see there's a question, something in the chat. I'm going to look for that. I would love before I talk about a few more things beyond what I've shared so far, who here has adjusted what they do now that they're back in the sanctuary based on what you were doing online? Or maybe a different way to phrase it, who here has made modifications now that you're back in the sanctuary that reflect what you learned, or still having people online? And Chip, can you kind of call on people?
Sure. I think, yeah, Ed, thank you for raising your hand. Go ahead.
So I pastor a small, about 120 people in attendance UCC church in Northern Kentucky. And we never actually, throughout the whole pandemic, never did live streaming or live video. All of our stuff was pre-recorded, and we've kept that. But we've shortened it down dramatically. Like during the pandemic, we did like the whole service, prayers, songs, the whole thing.
Yeah.
And what we found when we looked at like our YouTube stats was no matter what we did, like if we had 60 minutes, the average view time was like 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And as we talked to people, the vast majority of people kind of sheepishly, once they were honest, said that they would listen to a song, they would skip ahead to the sermon, and that was it.
Yeah. Well, I love that.
So what we've done now since post-pandemic, because we don't have the capability of doing live streaming well. No. We have stayed with pre-recording, and it's basically just a song, scripture, and sermon. And that's what we've kept it doing, and it's working for us right now.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because I mean, one of the things I am going to mention at the end, I mean, we all know that what we do depends on a variety of things. What are the resources we have? The resources of our time, the resources of our money, and of our skills. I mean, not every church, not every community has the money or the people skills to do certain things. And then also the time. I mean, I'm really curious about this, still doing some of the pre-recorded, because we have found that after the return to the sanctuary, some of the things we did for worship that was pre-recorded, there was some creativity and some neat things we did that you can't do in a sanctuary. Like the minister, you can't do in the sanctuary, you can record ahead of time, but whether it be the minister sitting beside a lake, whether it be doing interviews on the street with people, there are a variety of things that we did creatively that are missing in the sanctuary that some people miss. And I'm totally interested in the idea that you still do some pre-recording, but it's truncated, because I know early in the pandemic, we tried to do the whole service. Like we were, way too much. Like it was the full 60 minutes. It was all, even if it was just one person singing the doxology, and we're like you over time, we're like, 60 minutes is really not what we need to be doing for our services based on our viewership as well. How about others? What did you do during the pandemic? It doesn't have to be only preaching. What changes or adjustments did you make that have continued? Or what are ways in which what you did online shaped what you're doing in person, if you were online and now in person?
Bob, go ahead. Bob Gustafson.
Well, I would just say, Ed, you're not a small church at 120. But I'm in a small church. We worship about 20 in the sanctuary and about 20 online. And we have continued to put a lot of focus on participation. And with our small groups, we make sure that we get prayer requests from people online. It's common to have my liturgist online. So we're trying to focus on having people participate, even though they're doing it through a screen. And we do it very crudely. We're a Zoom church.
Amen.
My wife runs the camera, plus the one on the pulpit. It's crude, but it seems to be working.
Yeah. Well, I love, thank you for talking about participation, because, one of the, because when we think about engaging people online, if we think about the short attention spans, and if we think about the opportunity to do other things, and when we think about the different modes of learning, engaging people online, I'll tell you that we do that less ably now that we're back than when we were fully online. And whether that be offering images as part of the sermon, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I love the idea of taking prayer requests. We do have an online host. So one of our staff people is a host for every one of our worship services. And they do, here's a link to the friendship pad. Here's a link to giving. Here's a link to that website that Peter talked about. But that tends to happen, I'm not going to call it accidentally. We're not as intentional as we should be about truly engaging people. So Bob, thank you for that reminder that one way to garner attention and one way to engage is to literally engage, ask, solicit, invite, provide opportunity. Yeah. How about one other person about things that you did that are continuing, or ways in which what you did online has shaped some of what you're doing in person?
We continued to do a separate pre-recorded service for about 2 years. We just ended it at the end of 2022, and we had and the reason we ended it was, and the reason we kept doing it was all the reasons you were talking about, Peter, that the format allowed for better engagement for those online, and the service ended up being about 35 minutes. The online version. Our in-person version is 1 hour and 15 minutes. So but it was a resourcing thing, and the pre-recorded had gotten stale because we had focused on the live stream. A few weeks ago, we had a medical emergency in the church, and actually it was the same woman. It ended up 2 weeks in a row, and EMS had to get called. And the first time we actually stopped the service. The second time we didn't, and part of the reason, even though no one really was in the service was paying attention to me, everyone online, there was 20 people online, and they would have had no idea what was going on. And I knew that if we stopped, we'd probably lose all of them. If you have a blank space for even 10 seconds, you're worried about losing people. It's interesting to realize that the needs of those in person and the needs of those online are definitely different.
Yeah.
And it's like, do you have to sacrifice one for the other when you're doing that live stream? Or in a way you do, in the same way that maybe you do with different generations when you're speaking to them. And my comment related to your just the stats you showed related to the fact that a majority of people are really hybrid now. They're going back and forth in person, online, and that's a generational difference too. I know the younger people are, if they're out of town or they're not getting up, sometimes they're here, sometimes they're online. And the number of people we have who are exclusively online still there's a number, but they're limited. They're very limited. Yeah.
Yeah. And Adam, you raised some great segues into what I'm about to talk about, which has to do with the nature of the people who are online, but also issues that come with being hybrid. And certainly any of us who've led worship, when you think about that medical emergency, that is, obviously the hardest part is the person experiencing the emergency. but that it's always weird, awkward, hard as the leader in that space, and then to add in the idea of being online. Hey, real quick, before I slide into some of my stuff that I had that relates to what you said, why did you said you ended the pre-recorded because you just felt it was becoming stale and you were turning more of your focus to the in-person, or?
No, not actually, no, not that we turned into the in-person, but it was a resourcing point. We had an older former staff member who we had kind of continued with the production and editing of the pre-recorded, and we brought on actually a new associate pastor with a focus on the digital side, but also the integration. And you mentioned Kerry Newhoff. One of the things he talked about related to this conversation is that to move away of thinking of the sermon as attractional, but more of the anchor. Not that you're attracting people to worship, but it's the anchor to your life together. And are there ways to digitally engage around the anchor beyond just a worship service? Like we're doing a series on miracles right now, and we've had some people who could offer a personal testimony about a miracle that they believed that they experienced, and we had that testimony in worship, but we were able to actually offer a longer testimony online that posted that on Monday, that went up, and with a brief commentary. But it was different than what they got in the worship, but it was connected to it, and people were able to further engage or continue the conversation that had started on Sunday. So we're still trying to figure it out too, in terms of where the other thing that happened, because the pre-recorded had to be, this was just my own issue. Pre-recorded, I had to have the sermon done by Thursday, which was fine. I did it, but by Sunday, the quality of the delivery and the content and the message was just so much superior on Sunday that that was another reason we stopped it. But
and the other issue and one of those pre-recorded issues too, Adam, is that we all probably had the experience at some time during the pandemic. You pre-record that sermon, and then how many mass shootings happened between the sermon and Sunday, or
sure.
a George Floyd event? And so you'd end up with these sermons that were pre-recorded that didn't have any recognition that the world had just been upended in some ways, which is a hard part of pre-recorded. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit more about that. It's great to hear. I want to say one thing about attention spans as a lead into this issue of hybrid worship, because even as I talk about reduced attention spans and keeping people focused online, it is true that when people are in a group, in an audience setting, there is a longer, better ability to stay with. Some estimates are 10 minutes for an attention span for folks who are in an audience. And some of that may be generational as well. And let me give you an example of that. We've come back from our online worship to being hybrid, as you can tell from the way I talk about people there and people here. Our early two services, we do an 8:45 service and a 9:45, are still 45 minutes long. That's a reflection of a couple of things. I haven't had anybody come to me, anybody under the age of 70, asking, can our services be longer again? And can you, Peter and Robert and John and Caitlin, preach longer again? I've had people over the age of 70 ask for longer services and longer sermons. So the person I mentioned earlier who said, Peter, on Sundays, I watch Scott Black Johnston and I watch you, he came to complain to me. And what he came to complain about was that my sermons were too short and that he didn't consider them, quote, worth listening to. His words to me, and I'm friends with this person. He said, Peter, when you came, I thought you were a wonderful preacher. I'm just not sure now because you don't talk long enough for me to engage the topic. And I think you spend too long on your children's sermon and that there's not enough time in worship for preaching. Now, I would say to him, if you join us at 11 o'clock online, the sermons are always longer at 11 o'clock because we have to fill up the whole hour for the radio. That's a whole different topic, and I'll mention that in a moment. So there are, so almost every Sunday I've got the 8:45 sermon and slightly longer and a little bit different is the 9:45 sermon. And then I've got my 11 o'clock sermon. My 9:45 sermon will usually have a video in it because we have a screen and we can play the video. And at 11 o'clock, I describe the video because that's our more traditional service where we don't have a video screen that we use in worship in the same way. So all the sermons are a little bit different. And my last sermon is the longest of the day. So this person who wants me to preach longer, I said, you can come at 11. It is a longer sermon. But the fact that we've got people online and people in person, that hybrid worship does kind of impact what we do as preachers. And so a couple of ways that are certainly that I'm thinking about in terms of having people online. What's it mean to have folks who will never be in the building? And what assumptions we make within the context of our space and our people. What do I mean by that? I've got worshipers who haven't been in Davidson, North Carolina ever or in years. And yet, what does it mean to try and speak to them, even as I speak to people who are in person about the common life that we're sharing? What assumptions do I make about that common life, about the spaces, about the things we do that might be over the heads or outside of the bounds of what the people online know? And how do I interpret that for the people who are online? What's it mean that I've got folks who join us that are never going to be members of the church? How much of what I share presumes membership, presumes being Presbyterian? We all know that the religious marketplace, to use a term, is as fluid as it's ever been. If 60% of Presbyterian elders didn't grow up Presbyterian, and then some percentage of our online worshipers and even now our attendees didn't come out of our faith background and aren't part of our tradition and may never be, what assumptions do we make about what they know about being Presbyterian, about being Reformed? Do we explain who the old dead white guys like John Calvin are when we simply just talk about them? Do we utilize people that come from other traditions besides just the Presbyterian and Reformed? So that's another issue that arises. Something else that arises is that issue of images. Even if we aren't going to have a screen in our worship space, are we imagining for the online worshipers some things that we might be able to utilize at various points of the sermon that help keep them engaged? So this last week, in my sermon, I was talking about Jonah. I said, there's no shortage of people who've tried to capture, a sense of Jonah and the pathos of the story through art. And for the people online, a couple of pieces of art from Art in the Christian Tradition. It's at the revised lectionary website at Vanderbilt University. So the online worshipers got a couple of images that helped them there was something different on the screen to pull them back in beyond just Peter as a talking head. So we try and use images for the folks who are online to help with that engagement. So those are a couple of things that certainly that I wrestle with a little bit when it comes to having folks who are online. And then I happen to have in my church, and this is not about preaching per se, but it's about the production of our sermons online. I happen to have a former professional cameraman for PBS who's a church member. His name is Jack. And Jack routinely sits down with our live streamers to give them feedback on the video we're showing. And one of the things that Jack talks about is if you have the ability to do it, to have at least 2 camera angles during the sermon. That you might start out slightly a little bit wider, not like wide the whole chancel, but have a little bit more beyond my torso. And maybe that's for the words of welcome that Peter often offers before he does the reading and for the reading. And then sometime during the sermon, a second shot that comes in closer that catches something a little bit more like what you're seeing now for the actual preaching event. But he encourages having at least 2 camera angles that you use deliberately so that at some point during the sermon, there's a visual cue that reconnects people to being able to engage with what's on the screen. And I appreciate Jack's feedback when it comes to our worship services and what it means to capture us preaching and talking online. I had another note that I seem to have forgotten that I can't seem to find right now, and I apologize for that. Something else that I think has changed, I think about a little bit with preaching in the post-pandemic world, if we've got a certain number of folks who are watching online that may even include members from former congregations. What's it mean now to tell the story about what happened at your last church when someone may be watching who can tell the person, hey, Howard, I heard Peter mention you in his sermon down at Davidson College Presbyterian Church. I mean, we all knew, pre-pandemic or some point in our ministry, you should usually get people's permission if they're going to be there in person. And if they're not going to be there, but they're a part of your community. The rule of thumb I used to have with my children was, number one, not only did I get their permission, I would tell them the story ahead of time so that they would know to be able to say, Dad, it didn't happen that way. I don't know about you, but occasionally as a preacher, the story shifts a little bit because I'm trying to craft it for an audience. And sometimes the kids are like, it didn't happen that way, Dad. Or, you know what? I don't need everybody to know I'm adopted. So I would prefer that you not tell the story about when you got me from the orphanage, right? And so, but now that we're online, and so when you talk about your crazy aunt or uncle, and one of your cousins might watch and tell your aunt and uncle that they got called crazy in worship, like there's now a new ethics regarding the stories we tell about people, because they might be watching us or their friends might be watching us, and word gets back, and have we been faithful? Have we honored the relationships and the confidentiality that we had with them? And so that's something that's very much on my mind these days as a preacher who's online. What's it mean to talk about what happened at prior churches? I've got some other things I want to mention about online, the presence of our online worshipers, but I'm going to pause there for a moment. As you all think about the fact that some percentage of the people you're connecting with are either watching a pre-recorded service or live streaming, what are things that have arisen for you about questions regarding that, whether it be camera angles, whether it be the content, the use of images, the ethics of talking about people? What are some other things that you've been wrestling with? And would love maybe for some folks who haven't commented yet to be folks that chime in this time.
Can I just ask a short question, Peter,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
reference when you talk about your 11 o'clock sermon length?
Yeah.
Like what is the minutes there? And also you said in the beginning you preach 2 or 3 times a month. How is your length impacting the other preachers at Davidson?
Yeah, so one of my colleagues thinks we should go back to an hour for all of our services, and that we don't have enough time for all the things we should be doing in worship. And I say to that colleague routinely, you are the only person who's asked me to do that, other than that one 70-year-old who asked me to preach longer. So I don't have anybody saying that we should go back to being an hour for all of our services. It does mean that if I'm going to kind of hold people's feet to the fire about sermon length, I better be honest about how long my sermons are and whether or not I'm holding to that. And I try and model that, Adam, that just because I'm the head of staff doesn't mean I get more time than everybody else. And so it does impact them. They've had to be a little more disciplined, and I've had to be more disciplined, frankly. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
how long is the 11 o'clock sermon?
the 11 o'clock sermon. So funny, I mean, like when I talk about it being longer, I mean, you all know how it goes as worship leaders. It kind of depends. Like 9:45, which is 45 minutes long. We had a baptism this last Sunday. So if you're factoring in a baptism on top of a normal service, like suddenly, and I didn't have that at 8:45 and didn't have that at 11. So instead of going from a shorter sermon to a longer to the longest sermon, I went from a medium-sized sermon to a shorter sermon to a much longer one. And 11 o'clock, even then, is it a communion Sunday? Is it not? But I would say on an average, normal 11 o'clock service, if I'm up there between my reading and my sermon for longer than 16 minutes, that's a longer day. Yeah. I think one Sunday, I bumped it back up for some reasons I don't know to be something more like 20. And one of my staff members said they heard a child in worship about 2 rows up go, "This is so long." Like, it is longer than usual. You're right. Oh, and maybe they were just speaking for everybody else. I don't know. What are some things that some of you all are wrestling with? Cassie?
No, I was just wondering, how do you explain, these big mega independent churches who have preachers that preach for 30, 40 minutes, and it almost seems to be in tension with, what you were talking about with people's attention spans, and yet they seem to be successful in what they're in their preaching style.
Yeah, Peter, I don't know. I mean, because I can only work with the folks I know and the places I am, and I can tell you right now, I've not been in a Presbyterian church where I could get away with preaching for 30 or 40 minutes. You know, I'm a lifelong Presbyterian, so I sometimes make jokes, and I hope people don't take them the wrong way. My mom, at my home church, they've had pastors who didn't grow up Presbyterian, and whenever they make Presbyterian jokes, my parents get really mad. But I feel like I can make them. Like Presbyterians, my experience, Presbyterians think the Holy Spirit leaves the room after 60 minutes, right? I mean, I don't know about you all, we can feel it. So Peter, I don't know enough about the context of those places that sets them up to be able to preach for that long. But I can only speak out of my context, which is there's no way I could preach for 37 minutes, which was, according to that Pew Research stat, the average before the pandemic. Maybe I'm just not a good enough preacher, which is fine.
Well, I mean, but it's working somehow, or reaching people.
It has been working, even they're in decline.
Say again?
It has been working, but I mean, every Christian tradition in the United States is actually in decline. I mean, even mega churches are seeing that slide. Yeah, but it's a great question, Peter. I do not have an easy answer for you by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, Cassie.
Things that I wrestle with is parents are a lot more welcome to having their kids online for different things. You know, we're posting a lot more pictures on Facebook, taking little videos, reels, TikToks, whatever with our kids. However, when we have those children moments with the kids and the kids come forward, parents are giving us permission. They can't cut the video of their kid picking their nose and not let that be in the tape. They can't cut what their kid said. You know, we can pick and choose as parents, I have too, what I post online. But in that space, in that time, when we're having those children moments online with kids, I can't pick and choose what my kids are going to say back to the other pastor or myself on staff during the children's moments. And I've just been wrestling with that a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually, you know, one of the things that we wrestle with a little bit is, and this is going to sound a little bit counterintuitive, it's not the right word, but in a day and age in which folks do post a lot about their kids online, what it means for us to post kids online. So like in our worship services, we don't include the names of kids who are under middle school. We don't include the last names of folks who are under the age of between middle school and the end of high school. We specifically during the children's time, make sure the camera catches from behind the children to the preacher and doesn't include the faces of the children during that particular time, trying to have some level of both privacy and protection for kids. And so having online worship also then raises questions about what it means for the people's participation to be offered more broadly than the worship space. Because you can imagine folks being able to watch online and get a sense of a child and their family, and it does happen. Ooh. Pulled my headphones out because I was using my hands. Chip, you've got your hand up.
I do, although Charles had his hand up first.
Charles,
Yeah, sorry. I guess just the two comments to thinking about that. We actually got a technology grant. I can't remember if it was through the Peace USA or through the Synod or honestly through the Presbyterian. But like for the exact purpose of technology, right? And like, you know, using that for our worship. And we're kind of in the midst of like this reshuffle of like, we've unfortunately been, I guess, committing, that sin of having just the phone in the sanctuary, and that just doesn't really cut it. And we have, we're a very small church, and we do have some members that do regularly either or travel abroad or winter in someplace else, so they do really love the live stream to be able to continue that connection. So I feel like we're in the middle of that, and I think we're like kind of experimenting with like a Mevo camera and getting that better audio reception, because being able to hear and is like part of that engagement, right? If you can't hear 50% of the service, it's not enjoyable. So, and I think that cue about the different cameras, Peter, is really important. I remember having a Zoom call recently with one of my colleagues who's out in Seattle, and I think his church is doing that exact thing where they're upgrading their cameras, where they even have one like right in the pulpit where like they can turn and like look right at it for moments if they want to, there's some part of their sermon. And I imagine that even part of the sermon crafting and the preaching becomes how do we utilize those cameras too as a part of the worship.
Yeah, Charles, you so, and then I call on Chip. I mean, when you talk about the audio, so I have another church member. He is a documentary filmmaker, and when we were making some videos early on for when it was all pre-recorded, Scott said, "Now, Peter, don't get me wrong. You want to capture images as well as you can, but people can forgive poor image quality, but if they cannot understand what you are saying, they will not stay with you." He said, so even if it's a little bit dark when you're at the auto body shop, we can deal with darkness, but if they can't hear over the sound of the hydraulic ratchet wrench, that's not the socket wrench, if they can't hear because of the cars going by on the highway, they're not going to stay with you. And so that idea of audio quality, like again, when I go back and look at our live stream and hear myself preach pre-pandemic, like it literally is an echo from the end of a bottle that's held at the end of the room type sound. Like who was really engaged with me as a preacher when they couldn't even hear what I was saying? Chip, and then I've got a couple of other things about our worshipers, and some what I'm going to say about some preaching in a moment isn't only about online, but Chip.
Yeah, Cassie, I wanted to thank you for bringing that up. I read a couple of newsletters from our partner Science for the Church recently, and they were interviewing I don't remember what her field was. I think she was a psychologist talking about what does it mean to live a life that is primarily curated as our online lives are versus our real life. And I do not have children, so I am not the right person to talk to parents about what they allow to be shown or what, but it feels to me like there's a tension, right? Of like, what we put online can only be our best foot forward. And we would never want to put something online where it was not our best foot forward. And so it would be an interesting conversation to have. So I will, if Peter sends me links, I'll include these links to there were 2 columns in this interview. I found it very fascinating. And I think it kind of interacts, Cassie, with what you were saying.
Thank you, Chip. So a couple of other things about just preaching in a post-pandemic world. We all know that worship attendance decreased during the pandemic, and it's rebounding in some ways. A lot of folks estimate that they're back to about 85% of their pre-pandemic worship. But there's some stats that are really provocative for us as preachers. If church membership's at its lowest point since the 1940s, fewer than 50% of Americans claim membership in a house of worship. Again, what does that mean about what we assume about what they know, their identity? If we know that even if we talk about Christians, 63% of Americans claim to be Christian. So as preachers, what are we assuming about our listeners when they come to us and worship, when they're online? I know what my director of youth ministry kind of routinely, in a very polite way, says things like, I don't know that a non-Christian's going to know what that was. I don't know that a non-Presbyterian has any clue what you mean when you say that. Peter, I think you need to be a better interpreter of some of the things that you're assuming about people's knowledge. And if we continue to have fewer folks who are Christian and fewer folks who are part of the worshiping life of a church, the people that come rolling into us are going to have less background, even if they come back into the setting. So I'm going to be with our young families class again this Sunday, talking about worship because their kids are in a sacraments class. Only about 30% of the members of that class grew up Presbyterian. Here's a new phrase, by the way, I loved it. One couple the other day said to me, Peter, when we first got married and didn't have kids, we were liturgically promiscuous. They talked about all the different places where they worshiped. And so they come to the Presbyterian Church wondering why we don't have the best of every tradition. They loved what they did at the Episcopal Church, and the Lutherans did this really well, and they liked this about the Catholic Church, and thought that this was cool in the Methodist Church. And then they come and go, oh, well, you know, can we have a little bit more of the best of everybody's tradition here? So it's really interesting as a preacher worship leader to deal with that liturgical promiscuousness. But here's something I want to share with you that I found so fascinating. I don't know if you all have seen this stat about who's coming back to worship. So look at this weekly church attendance by generation. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. The boomers aren't coming back in the same way. But look who's back, millennials and the millennials and Gen X are coming back in a way that's different than the boomers. So when we think about who we're trying to connect with, the kinds of cultural references we make, the touchstones for voices, and then frankly, I would say the racial, ethnic, religious backgrounds of the voices that we connect with. I can tell you the millennials and Gen X have an expectation we're going to do more than quote C.S. Lewis and John Calvin, but that we're going to be referencing Nadia Bowles-Weber, that we're going to be talking about theologians who come out of womanist or feminist or racial ethnic traditions that aren't just mainline white. And same with the music that we use. I mean, my kids on their playlists on their phones have everything, and they want to know why in worship we only sing one kind of musical style. Can we do all of that? Not necessarily. Can we do all that well? Certainly not. But we should be thinking about some of the things that we offer in worship based on the who's actually with us these days. Let me see if I can unshare my screen now. There we go. But I was blown away by that stat that now we're seeing that the millennials and Gen X are coming back as a higher percentage than baby boomers. I don't know if that surprised anybody else to read that stat, but it was a little bit of a surprise to me. So one last thing I want to share with you when it comes to post-pandemic. Some of you already knew this. I'm in a context that didn't know it. Here in the southeast part of the country, in this little branch of Presbyterianism, they believed that they were immune from the declining worship attendance that was being experienced in a lot of the rest of the country. They still thought that families would continue to come almost every Sunday and give 2 hours a week to church. And you know what happened during the pandemic? Southeast Presbyterianism caught up with the rest of the country. And we've now discovered not every family is going to give us 2 hours on a Sunday morning, and not every family is going to be here on Sunday. Especially when they've got not only a variety of competing claims, but an ability to access us when they're away is different. According to one study, the active church family is engaged with the church 1.8 times a month. Now, let me interpret that for you. Their child comes to youth group one night, and the family comes to church one Sunday. That's their 1.8 times that month that active church family was engaged. So what does that mean for, I don't know, a sermon series? Like if we think we're going to have some sort of connective thread that if people hear us on the first Sunday of Lent, that we can keep up to the last Sunday of Lent, good luck with that. There are a variety of ways to have a series, but a series cannot be this sermon based on the last one, based on the last one. There might be a loose connective thread, don't get me wrong. But like we're like you. When we think about a worship season, what does it mean that an active family is only going to be with us one Sunday of Advent? Because they're also active at youth group, and we're only going to see them one of those Sundays, or maybe they'll give us two. Don't get me wrong, there's some worshipers that still come 4 times a month, but there aren't as many, and they're not of a younger generation. And so for us as people who are planning worship and planning our preaching, how much we can assume from week to week in terms of making references to and pointing backwards. One other thing I want to mention, and then we'll get at some other questions and comments. Here's my other thing that I struggle with, and it goes back to something I said before. I believe that Presbyterians need to be a little more embodied in our worship. We should be more than brains and ears on a stick. But what does that mean then to do things in the worship space, and how I invite people at home to do those same things? If I have a call to worship that involves people on the pulpit and lectern sides turning and facing each other across the aisle, and do a call and response to one another instead of the worship leader to the worshiper, but worshipers to each other, how does that connect to, how does that pull in the person who's at home? Or do I just ignore the people at home and say sometimes they're just going to have to listen and watch, jump in where they can, but how does what we plan for the embodiment and in the space, is there a way to customize that, make it accessible to the people at home? I think sometimes we do that well, sometimes not so much, and I don't have a right answer about that, but I do try and think through, is what we're doing here in the space inclusive of the people at home, or do sometimes I just have to let it go? So what are some other things you all are wrestling with as preachers, as worship leaders, post-pandemic? I've shared some of mine. Edward, I see you noted something about people, there's something about oh, sorry, it was Edward was asking about people multitasking during online services. Yeah, it's a phenomenon, isn't it? What have you said you've heard from folks that they're in the kitchen making their scrambled eggs while you're preaching. How do you respond to that? What do you do with that knowledge?
I mean, I just go, okay, because, frankly, I do the same thing, and so I can't judge that. And I know that's also a reality. So in some ways, I feel like people are taking a lot of online things in, not as, almost like they're doing as they're listening to a podcast.
Yeah.
And
does that change how you preach or what you say or what you do, or you just know that's part of it, doesn't change anything?
If it's changed, it's probably been more unconscious. It's more just, I'm trying to focus on my preaching of how I function in the world, which is a multitasking thing. So I guess it's probably more of an unconscious thing than anything else. But yeah, my sense is it's rare that I think we have people who are doing in the post-pandemic, the family sitting down on the couch and watching.
Yeah. But it's a great little fiction to have in our mind, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Before the pandemic, I was preaching at a friend's church out in Colorado. And this was one of my first kind of thoughts about the fact that people may not be as fully engaged. I mean, we all know that people aren't attentive to every word we say at every moment of the sermon. I mean, everybody daydreams. And so I don't know what percentage of the people we have at any given moment, but just because they're in that space doesn't mean they're not noticing the cloud going by or looking at the stained glass window, whatever. I remember one time, I literally, this was my introduction. I said, "Hi, I'm Peter Henry. It's really nice to be with you. I hail from Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan, and in Detroit, we're the only major American city that looks south into Canada." And a woman pulls out her phone and fact checks me right there at that moment. Like, she goes to look at a map to see if I'm telling the truth about Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. I'm like, whoa, all right, everybody. She's been taken somewhere else for a couple of moments. I'll have to figure out how to reel her back in. How about others? What are some things that are on your mind or you're thinking about with your preaching and or worship leadership in this post-pandemic era? I assume there are some things I didn't even bring up that you've been studying or researching or you've been contemplating yourselves. Yeah, Lynette.
Well, I think in one observation is, and I'm at a larger church, but our folks who are worshiping online are still definitely paying attention to what is the energy they see in the sanctuary. They're commenting on how many people they see, and and what does that mean, and how many kids are leaving to go to the service. So they still really care about that. They want that vitality, and we are in a Grand Rapids bubble, so we're but yeah, I that is fascinating, or they get worried, but we also track how many people are engaging with the online worship and trying to communicate that to folks so they get some sense of what total engagement is, because they want to be reassured that it is okay.
Yep. Yeah. And Lynette, and how I will say one of my struggles is to respond to people who aren't with us in person without being judgmental. But there's a part of me wants to say, if you're worried about the number of kids who are coming up for the children's time, get your kids here, right? I mean, wouldn't that be nice? And when it comes to a sense of vitality, I mean, and I'm not going to speak for you, but as a preacher, when I get up on a Sunday, I mean, I know, like this last Sunday, I looked YouTube, we had like 300 and some views, and there are different stats about how many people are watching and how long they're watching. I get that, but 300 some views. And then we probably had over our 3 services, I would guess probably 350 to 400, you know, but at our 945, it's felt smaller this last Sunday. And I know that there are another 95 views that are going to happen, some of which are even live, but it feels different to me as a preacher when the space isn't as occupied. And so it affects me, it affects the people there, it affects the people online. Back in the day when it was just nice and we know everybody's here, we can see them, we can all get energy together, and it's a little bit of a different ballgame and how you get a sense for that vitality for sure.
Well, I had the joy of coming here in June of 2020, so I only had an online congregation for the whole first year.
Yeah, wasn't that a great experience for all of us, just talking into a camera as opposed to talking to people? Like, I mean, we should be thankful that it's just not all camera.
Absolutely.
Someone mentioned, and so it was Edward again. I mean, I feel like we did some things well during the pandemic that we haven't done as well afterwards. I say we, I mean us here. But folks who I think utilize some of the online stuff well are the folks who say that thing in worship, cut that song out and make that a separate social media post. That part of Peter's sermon, we know there's a whole sermon, but that part, we think that's a snippet that folks should be able to get on, you know, one of our Instagram videos, because that can be a way to pull people in or to connect them to that anchor, as Adam said, when we utilize the things from our online live streaming that can reach out to the folks who weren't there and didn't even watch us online. So I love that reminder from Edward. And Adam Grosh, yeah, singing. I mean, we all had the fiction that everybody was singing those hymns at home. Weren't. Like my family, oh my gosh, when I would make them sing during online worship, like, are you really going to make us sing? I'm like, well, if you don't, it's only going to be me singing a solo, so you better join in so you don't have to hear just me. But do you feel like you definitely are, you said in there, you feel like you're noticing less congregational singing now that you're back?
Yeah, I think there's just, people feel like that singing is for professionals. That's for the choir, that's for the band. And the older stalwart Presbyterians are still singing because they always have, and they understand that. But especially talking about, you know, the people who are checking out church and haven't been Presbyterian or haven't been in church, they don't sing in their lives. There's no place that people, I mean, maybe they're doing it in the shower. I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but they're self-conscious. Oh, I can't sing, you know, even in the context of the gathered church. And if it's probably easier for people to sing if everyone around them is singing, but as fewer are singing, I just noticed that sometimes we have to be intentional about and that's what we're thinking through, intentional about inviting people to sing. Even as I say that, I've just been tuned into this whole movement called pub choir. Yeah. You know about that? Yeah, where they, like, people are paying for tickets to come together to be conducted, and the whole concert is them singing, but it's just incredible. You can find it online. Yeah, related to the people singing at home, interestingly, we received comments from, you know, the church people who are online at home. They want to see the lyrics, though. Yeah. Even if they're not singing, they want to see the lyrics, you know, in the bottom thirds of the camera view, or what they're getting. And I said, well, are you singing? And there are a couple who will say, oh yeah, I would sing, but even those who aren't singing, they still want to see the lyrics.
Sure.
And it can't be an either or. Like they also want to see, you know, the person up front singing. So they need both at the same time. And I mean, that's just a technical issue, but we realize that that's important.
Yeah, we flip-flop sometimes between using, so for those who are Presbyterian, the Glory to God hymnal, they did have a PowerPoint projection
Yeah.
file. So we sometimes will use the PowerPoint images, but then the people can't see. But then we tell ourselves that if we don't have the notes, how will they know what notes to sing? And so we will sometimes, but then put the lyrics up anyway. But along those lines, when we think specifically about preaching, when we think about engaging people who are online, and we think about the different ways of learning, you know, some of this stuff takes forethought, and I feel like I was more thoughtful about some of this stuff during the pandemic than here I am on the other side of the worst of it. But we all have seen the speaker who puts the quote. So you do quote from Nadia Bowles-Weber. You actually put the quote on the screen so that even as you're reading it, people can visually see it, that some folks will learn differently reading it versus only hearing it, that there are ways with that hybrid worship for the person who's at home, we can continue to connect with them even as we still primarily offer a discourse, one person speaking for a longer period of time. But in addition to images, pulling out quotes is another way to kind of grab people's attention, to refocus them in on what you're hearing. One other thing about preaching, and then I want to hear Raina comment on communion. So Chip Hardwick will remember this, one of the first classes where he and I were teaching fellows at Princeton Theological Seminary. Randy Nichols, one of our preaching professors, gets up and spends 20 minutes deriding three-point sermon as something antiquated and something that's no longer effective. And then Cleo LaRue gets up and says, I don't know, I preach in African-American churches every Sunday and we still use the three-point sermon. But think for a moment about a sermon that has very specific points. And so some of us, you know, Tom Long, the new homiletic, Fred Craddock, and sometimes when we think about like the homiletic plot with Eugene Lowry and this idea there's a narrative and that it goes over the course of the 10 to 16 minutes. If someone's not with us for a full 10 to 16 minutes to follow that narrative or to follow the inductive sermon, but I'll tell you what, three-point sermon with some very identifiable things and that old tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. In an age of shorted attention spans where people are making their eggs in the kitchen while they're listening to you preach, maybe that tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, having some specific points isn't always so bad in terms of helping people at least come away with something very specific they heard that was a shorter part of this longer experience called the sermon. Raina, talk about communion. You had it with a question mark. I'm going to put the question mark back at you. What were you either looking for? Or what do you want to say about that?
I'd like to hear more about how the best way to do communion online, when online, and to invite those watching to, participate online. How is that done?
So again, telling a little bit of shame on me, and then I want someone else to tell me the best way to do it. When we were all online, we were really good about saying, this is a communion Sunday. Have your juice and your bread ready to go. And during the service, when the minister takes the bread, you take it at home too. So we invited people to take communion at home. I don't know what John Calvin and others would have thought about that theology, but so what? But now that we're back in person, I can't remember the last time I said something like, and now for you all at home, I hope that you have your bread and juice ready. I can't remember the last time we signaled to people at home that we'd like you to have a communion experience too. So I'm not going to tell you that we've come anywhere near the best way. How about for others? How are you doing communion if you are part of some sort of hybrid church experience where you've got folks in person and online? Someone tell me how we should be doing it. Bob Gustafson, you unmuted yourself.
I'm not going to necessarily tell you how you should do it. I can tell you how we do it. We have made sure that people pick up the elements as they enter the sanctuary so that we're not using that time to distribute or do things that people online can't do. And we have an electronic greeter who reminds people this is a communion Sunday. Make sure you get your juice and bread. But we try and make it as equivalent an experience online as in person as we can.
That is fascinating because I hadn't even thought about what that looks and feels like for the online worshiper to sit there waiting for the 250 people present to come forward to get their elements and go back. We hope they're listening to the music, I guess. So that's interesting, Bob. How about for others? How do you handle communion in a hybrid experience?
Just as a side comment, it takes a lot less time that way too.
Yeah, and as a follow-on to that, that's really changed my preaching for when we do communion, because my communion messages used to be markedly shorter because we used to distribute the elements out in the pews and so forth. But now they pick up the, like the little shot glass with the wafer on top. And so, communion does not take very long.
How about someone else reflect on communion?
Can I share?
Yeah.
We don't change anything. And I think, so this past Sunday I had to worship at home, and because I'm in quarantine, finally got it after so many years, finally got the COVID. But one of the things I've noticed with worship, we're one of those churches that have communion every Sunday. So we know it's going to happen. However, online is also a big evangelical presence or outreach for people. They're going to watch your sermon. They're going to watch your worship online before they come in person, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's kind of getting a taste of what it is. We do change the angle, the camera shot, so you're seeing people come up. But think about it. People are in their homes. They've just been washing their dishes or doing other stuff as they're listening to their sermon. That break of not having to do something, it gives you the time to go and pull out the piece of bread and look and check and see if you have any wine or grape juice or apple juice or whatever you got, right? And it gives a little bit of break in time in the service for people to do stuff at home. It gives that breathing time at home. And it's not like you're gone forever, and you have the music and the background is still coming through. We have the words up for communion still, but I don't think it's bad to have that space for communion for people to do the things they're going to be doing at home anyways.
And Cassie, one of the things I think for all of us, and then I'm gonna grab Lynette, and then I know Chip will want me to round things out. I mean, for any one of us to think about, there are going to be experts who tell us things about people. There are going to be folks who tell us things about what other churches are doing. Ultimately, we're always still going to be the in-house practical theologian for our congregations, and being able to identify not only what are other practices, but what are best practices for us is always our calling. We've always had to sift through what other people are doing versus what we're doing here. I would say it's heightens isn't even the right word. It's just in a different key right now. But so Lynette, you're going to be the last person I'm going to call on, and then I'm going to wrap this up, and then Chip will send us out. So Lynette. You're muted, Lynette.
Sorry about that. So 3 quick things. One, to the communion. Yeah, like Cassie, we go up. I love that energy. I have folks who really want us to go back to doing the trays, passing the trays once in a while, but that would be like torture online. I think. So that's one thing. Number 2, I love what Cassie said about folks, checking us out. What I tell our people is that by the time somebody walks into our church, it's their 3rd visit to the church. First has been the website, second's been the online service, and then when they actually get there. And then the other last comment that we have found kind of by accident is we've, our staff has been intentionally, probably once a month, doing intergenerational activities with lunch after our main worship service. And that has been so life-giving, and really helping to rebuild community.
Thank you for sharing that, Lynette. And thank you to everybody for sharing and for being here. You can obviously tell I'm right on the ground with you all, trying to figure stuff out. And some weeks I feel like we've done well. Other weeks I feel like we're relearning things that we should have remembered from the pandemic. But I'm grateful for the fact that there's still a calling and a place and a wrestling with what we do as worship leaders and as preachers. And by the way, thank you for being willing to go with me beyond preaching a little bit, because I do think, as you heard me say, preaching isn't something that happens out of any other context. It's part of a bigger experience called worship. And I think some of the things we talked about today reflect that. I'm going to send to Chip some of my notes and some of my links, and you can follow up on those as you feel called. And but again, just want to say I'm grateful for you taking some time today to listen to me reflect a little bit, but more importantly, to hear you all share with one another. So Chip Hardwick, back in your hands, because I know you're like me, like to stick to the times you tell people.
Yes. So let's give Peter happy hands for all that
you
he
all.
has taught us. I was really challenged by what I heard and to think differently about some of my commitments. And so I'm wrestling with how I will put them into practice. That's a sign of a really thoughtful workshop and a really thoughtful workshop leader. So Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I realized I failed to pray us in. So let's just pray ourselves out. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the role you've given us to preach. It is challenging in every situation and in every season and every generation. And it is challenging in particular ways in this season and in this generation. We give you thanks, oh God, for Peter's thoughts, his perspectives, his challenges as we think about serving you faithfully. Send your Spirit that each and every time we preach in whatever circumstances, we would bring you glory and your people would become more and more like Jesus Christ. We pray in his name. Amen. Don't forget, next month, it will be Carolyn Helsel on preaching on racism in an age of CRT bans. Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.